Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid have had enough of Boris Johnson. He has lost his Chancellor and his Health Secretary. Is this the beginning of the end for the Prime Minister?
I'm coming out to explain it because I'm fed up with people, if I may say so, Chris, saying things on my behalf.
Well, Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid will certainly never speak for him again, and other ministers may regret they ever did. Now Sunak and Javid are the lightning rods for the rumbling rebellions in the backbenches. Is Boris Johnson fast running out of road? Tonight we devote the programme to the crisis for the government and the country.
Nadhim Zahawi, are you standing by the Prime Minister?
He's moved fast. Nadhim Zahawi is the new Chancellor, Steve Barclay the new Health Secretary. But will Boris Johnson still be Prime Minister at this time tomorrow? We'll be speaking to senior Conservatives, former Cabinet Ministers and to political insiders. Good evening. Sleaze, Barnard Castle, Wallpapergate, Partygate, a vote of confidence, catastrophic by-elections. Boris Johnson has withstood them all. But now the mess number 10 has made over the case of Chris Pincher has been the final straw for two of Boris Johnson's most senior cabinet colleagues. The words in the resignation letters are excoriating. This from Rishi Sunak. The public rightly expects the government to be conducted properly, competently and seriously. The now former Chancellor went on to say that on the huge economic challenges, it has become clear to me that our approaches are fundamentally too different. And from Sajid Javid, writing that the vote of confidence was a moment for humility, grip and new direction. I regret to say, however, it's clear to me that this situation will not change under your leadership, and therefore you have lost my confidence too. Well, there have been a number of other resignations in the ranks tonight, so here's our political editor with everything tonight, Nick Watt.
Well, Kirsty, this is a premiership in deep peril, but Boris Johnson wants to send the signal that this is not a premiership crumbling. And so tonight, behind me in Downing Street, he's been reconstructing his cabinet, all that after the double blow of those double resignations. United during a national emergency, now a rupture as attention turns to the Prime Minister's integrity. In quick succession, but with no coordination, we are told, Sajid Javid and then Rishi Sunak resigned. Two of the Cabinet's political heavyweights out and turning their firepower on Boris Johnson. In his second Cabinet departure under this Prime Minister, Sajid Javid said, "I am instinctively a team player, but the British people also rightly expect integrity from their government. The tone you set as a leader and the values you represent reflect on your colleagues, your party, and ultimately the country." Shortly after that, the Chancellor quit, saying, "The public rightly expect government to be conducted properly, competently, and seriously. I recognise this may be my last ministerial job, but I believe these standards are worth fighting for, and that is why I am resigning."
It was something that was only raised with me very cursorily.
News of those resignations broke as Boris Johnson apologised for appointing Christopher Pincher as Deputy Chief Whip in February, despite being warned of his behaviour around 3 years ago.
Yes, I think it was a mistake, and I apologise for it. I think in hindsight it was the wrong thing to do. I apologise to everybody who's been badly affected by it.
A more humble tone which contrasted with the official government line earlier that the Prime Minister had forgotten about this warning and had acted with probity.
We are fortunate in this country to have a sophisticated and robust system for upholding public standards.
Guffaws at this even from ministers, including Cabinet member Baroness Evans on the left, as her colleague Lord True set out the number 10 line to peers. It's early evening and Boris Johnson is holed up in Downing Street with aides trying to plug the holes in what looks like a sinking premiership. A short while ago, one of his closest allies told me it'll all be over by this time tomorrow. There is no way any Prime Minister can survive a double resignation of such senior cabinet ministers. Others are not so sure and say this Prime Minister will not give up without a fight. But he's swimming against unease in cabinet, which was clear this morning as glum faces stared out at the start of their weekly meeting. After that, even loyalists struggled with the question of the day. You're the key law officer. Do you think the Prime Minister's been giving a wholly truthful account of his knowledge of Christopher Pincher?
Completely supporting the Prime Minister. We're getting on with the job of tackling inflation, supporting families through the cost of living and supporting our friends in Ukraine.
Do you believe he's giving a truthful account of what he knew about Christopher Pincher?
Have you been down in Downing Street all day?
I've been out here waiting for
Well, you
people
can
like
wait for me. Well, I've been very busy in the cabinet with the Prime Minister. So.
But is the Prime Minister telling the truth about what he knew about Christopher Pincher?
I have no reason to doubt the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister have been pretty clear on a lot of these things, and you know, the whip got removed from Christopher Pincher within the same day of the accusations that were reported on that day, and so, you know, I think he took action at the right time.
Do you think the Prime Minister's giving a truthful account of what he knew about Christopher Pincher?
I think he is. He's very sincere, very genuine. It was an HR matter. I'm actually not allowed to speak to the press, so I'm going to... But, yeah, I mean, it is an HR matter, and that, you know, he took appropriate action, and as soon as a formal complaint was lodged, he took the action to remove the whip.
Calm on the outside for now, but inside, a frantic operation underway to save this premiership.
And Nick joins us now. Nick, do you think Boris Johnson has done enough to staunch the wound?
Well, it's just under 3 years, Kirsty, since Boris Johnson won a substantial parliamentary majority, but tonight he is fighting to stay in office. Now, if he were a conventional Prime Minister, he would have been gone probably a month ago. Think of that. Narrowly won a confidence vote, and then a month later he loses 2 very senior cabinet ministers. But as we know, this is no conventional Prime Minister, and the rules have generally never applied to Boris Johnson in his life. Now, his allies are divided over his prospects, and by allies, I mean very close allies. You saw in my film I was reporting one ally who said to me, the Prime Minister, it'll all be over by tomorrow night. But interestingly, I spoke to another ally, a minister who spent some time with Boris Johnson this evening, and this minister said to me the Prime Minister is very bullish at the moment and absolutely did not look like a Prime Minister who is about to relinquish the seals of office. Just after we heard of those double resignation, the Prime Minister met around 80 of his closest allies in his rather large suite of offices in Parliament, and he was joking about how the resignation of Rishi Sunak means he can give them what they want, which are tax cuts. But there is anger amongst those who decided to resign. I spoke to one member of the government payroll who decided to go. They said to me, I just cannot appear in public and defend this Prime Minister. I cannot look into the barrel of a camera and keep lying.
However, there is a way in which, of course, those rebels can actually manoeuvre to have Boris Johnson removed, and that is through changing the rules in the 22 committee. Tell me about that.
Well, Conservative MPs have been meeting in huddles tonight, working out what steps there are from now. They are very confident, those rebels, that they will have the numbers in the elections to the 1922 executive next week to ensure that there's a majority to change the rules to ensure that there can be another vote of confidence in the Prime Minister. The plan is to hold that really quickly. They are absolutely confident that they can win that, and what that would mean is that would then remove Boris Johnson from office, because he is not going to resign. Looks like we can expect a very determined fight back from the Prime Minister. Suggestion from some allies that he might put a general election on the table to frighten those Tory critics. Interestingly, I was talking to one Tory grandee familiar with many Conservative leaders, many Conservative Prime Ministers. They said Boris Johnson's departure is not imminent. but the cabinet is now destabilised. He'll be gone by the summer holiday.
Nick, thanks very much. Well, I'm joined now by the former Cabinet Minister and former Chief Whip, Andrew Mitchell, and Ruth Davidson, formerly the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, who is now in the House of Lords. Now, we have tried hard, but sadly in vain, to tempt any supporters of the Prime Minister onto the programme. Good evening to you both. Thank you very much for joining us. First of all, Andrew Mitchell, what have you made of the last 5 days?
Well, I'm afraid it is over, and the question now is how much longer this is going to go on and what damage will be done to the country and indeed to the Conservative Party brand. But it is over, and tonight the Prime Minister must think very carefully about what is in the best interests of the country and of the Conservative Party.
But when you say it's over, there is no way it is going to be over right now unless he was to resign. And certainly by what we heard from Nick about his tone tonight, that's highly unlikely. And if he manages not to lose any other cabinet ministers, he's not necessarily going to be gone even before October, before the next election even.
It's a bit like the death of Rasputin. He's been poisoned, stabbed, he's been shot, his body's been dumped in the freezing.
But don't you need resilience in your Prime Minister?
In the freezing river, and still he lives. But this is an abnormal Prime Minister, a brilliantly charismatic, very funny, very amusing, big character. But I'm afraid he has neither the character nor the temperament to be our Prime Minister.
Now, Ruth Davidson, you've made no bones about your animosity to the Prime Minister. So this, I suppose, is a kind of softball question in one way. What do you make of the idea that he spoke to his supporters tonight in a very bullish form? He has to be a bully and he has to be up there, doesn't he? That's the way he survives.
Well, I think, Kirsty, to say that it's some sort of personal animosity is not true. Actually, I find him quite good company, but I do think he's ill-equipped to be Prime Minister. I think it matters the values that you hold in public office. I think that it matters to the public that their leaders show the values of the country. And I think that integrity is important. And I think where I've clashed with the Prime Minister, it has been either on deeply held policy positions where we've taken opposite sides of it, or where I think that his performance in the job has not matched the office of Prime Minister. And as a Conservative, I believe very strongly in upholding the offices of this country. And so I think that it's not fair to just say, we've never gotten on, because actually...
No, I wasn't meaning personal animosity, to be fair. Yes.
Yeah. I think MPs have a decision to make. This is clearly coming to the end game, and they can either decide that it's going to end slowly, tortuously, drawn out with rebellion after rebellion because authority is leached from number 10, or they can move to change the rules of the 22, bring this to a head, make sure that the Prime Minister leaves, that there is a leadership contest over the summer, that there's a new leader installed by the October conference. You can unveil a new team, a new vision, a new direction for the country. And then you've got a fighting chance come the election in 2024. But at the moment, there is not a Conservative politician out there, I promise you, that has not had people telling them all year that, they're usually a Conservative, but I'm sorry, I just can't vote for you while this man is in number 10.
And I'll come on to you with what that means in Scotland in a moment. But Andrew Mitchell, just coming back to you. About these resignations, did they feel very different or not? Because you have Rishi Sunak pointing very clearly to economic different priorities, to fiscal differences, to the idea we hear that he was against a cut in VAT, which Boris Johnson wanted to announce next week.
Well, both letters are absolutely devastating, and they speak not only to differences on policy, they speak about the Prime Minister's character and his temperament. And that is why this is so devastating, this double resignation tonight, with many other people who are highly respected in the party deciding that they cannot continue. That's very important, and that's why I say it's just a question of time now. He will be gone very soon. It's a question of time and damage that's done.
But in order to oust him, as his critics want to do, don't you need not just to have people resigning, you need plotters and a plot?
Well, the 22 committee will represent the views of the Conservative Parliamentary Party. Tonight, the views of the Conservative Parliamentary Party are overwhelmingly that the game is up and that Boris has got to go. And as I say, that will happen over a period of time now. I've seen a number of these sad events, but it will happen. What is much in the interest of the country and of the party is that Boris should recognise this and go. I'm not sure he will do that, but it will become increasingly clear over the next day or so that that is the case.
Tell me, do you think, Ruth Davidson, what impact this will have on the backbenchers? Because I know you are not on the backbenches, but do you agree with Andrew Mitchell that over time there'll be a drip, that the 22 will move? Or do you think now the possibility is the backbenchers go, we just have to calm this whole thing down, we will stop griping?
Well, I think the question is if there are those within the party who always believe that you should back the leader, and that's an understandable position when you're in an organisation. I have no beef with that. But the question is, to what end? Because I cannot see a Johnsonism, a kind of hallmark of this premiership that we can only achieve as a party for the country with this Prime Minister in power. In fact, what I see is an element of drift, of not being on top of the detail, of having a confused policy position, of not being able to get on the front foot to deliver for the country, because we're so often firefighting drama after drama, crisis after crisis, getting through the next news cycle because of all of the noise that surrounds this Prime Minister. So the question is, what would they be keeping him in power for? And this doesn't have to drip on forever. It will come to a head in the next few weeks. There will be a vote to elect who forms the 1922 committee. There will be people who come forward on a platform to be able to change the rules that you can have another vote of no confidence within a year. And if they triumph and there's 60 letters in, there will be another vote of no confidence. And we will see this move quite quickly, I think.
But in the end, Andrew, the problem is, of course, the people are facing a cost of living crisis. They just want the politicians to get on with it. Maybe the idea that they're going to some kind of long drawn-out bloodletting is not going to be very attractive when they're trying to feed their families.
These are very difficult problems which our constituents face, but we need a fresh start. We cannot have it, I'm afraid, under Boris. And I have seen how this movie ends. I was a young officer strapped to the mast between 1992 and 1997.
And of course, we're going to speak to Lord Heseltine later in the programme.
And you will find, I'm afraid, that we get into a position before long where that becomes inevitable. That's not inevitable at the moment. We still have a chance to change and then to improve what we're doing and to win.
And I wonder, Ruth Davison, if you think on another basis a change might do well on the position on the union, because as you know, there's from your own mouth there's been a view of Boris Johnson, please stay away in Scotland during elections, and I wonder if you think that would change the dynamic of this plan to save the union.
Well, I don't think that it's any surprise to anybody that watches any polling at all that this Prime Minister has not been a particularly popular Prime Minister in Scotland, and it has polled significantly below the Conservative Party in Scotland for the entirety of his premiership. But to get back to your point that you asked Andrew Mitchell there, I entirely agree, Kirsty. There will be those around the Prime Minister who work for him, that are trying to keep him in post, those loyalists around him within the cabinet and within the backbenches who support him, and they will devote all their energies to trying to keep him where he is. And the great tragedy of that is actually the energies of everybody in government should be towards what they're there for, which is to serve the public, a public that's had 2 years where the resilience is at the lowest point because they've been dealing with COVID and all of the fallout and all of the trauma and everything that's happened around them, and are now facing into the winds and the gales of an economic crisis, not just an international and national economic crisis, but one that's hitting their own pocket and their own family.
Thank you very much.
And that's where everyone should be.
I'm just going to have to move very quickly to Andrew Mitchell because we've just another resignation. So I just need a quick reaction from Andrew Mitchell. Former Solicitor General Justice Minister Alec Chalk has just resigned. What do you make of that one?
Well, he is a terrific colleague. He's an extremely good minister. The fact that he's resigned, I'm afraid, only adds additional credence to what we all know, which is that it's over now and Boris really must go.
Thank you both very much indeed. Well, the Prime Minister's insistence for 5 days that he didn't know anything about allegations against the former Deputy Chief Whip Chris Pincher crumbled spectacularly this morning. Lord Macdonald, the former top civil servant at the Foreign Office, pulled the rug from under Boris Johnson with a letter which made it clear that the Prime Minister was briefed in person about the initiation of an investigation into the then Foreign Office Minister, Chris Pincher, for inappropriate behaviour and the outcome. The complaint was upheld. So, was Boris Johnson obfuscating, lying, or as he said, had he forgotten? Had the Pincher problem been a one-off, Boris Johnson might not be in this predicament tonight. But the Prime Minister has form. Here's our policy editor, Lewis Goodall.
Yes, Kirsty, once again, the question at the heart of our politics, in a deeply atypical way, is the personal integrity of the Prime Minister and his staff. The Chris Pincher affair is just the latest episode with that at its centre. Once again, how Number 10 handles a problem becomes as problematic as the issue itself. But how did we get here? Well, on Thursday night, this letter emerged from the then Deputy Chief Whip, Chris Pincher. He said that he drank too much at the Carlton Club he resigned. It later transpired he was accused of groping two men, something he denies. Now, Downing Street said that the Prime Minister considered the matter closed and that there'd be no further action. But on Friday, one of Chris Pincher's Carlton Club accusers made a formal complaint. Mr Johnson was therefore forced to suspend Mr Pincher from the Conservative whip. The question of what the PM knew about previous allegations about Pincher then becomes central. And at this point, Downing Street said this: the Prime Minister was not aware before the appointment of any specific allegations. Indeed, this was the line that Number 10 had briefed to ministers to defend on the airwaves over the weekend.
To the best of my understanding, the Prime Minister has not been aware of specific allegations against Chris Pincher.
Now, in the meantime, the newspapers were full of allegations about Mr Pincher apropos other incidents, which Mr Pincher also denies. By Monday, despite all of that, the line was still the same.
Given a categorical assurance that the Prime Minister was not aware of any specific allegation or complaint made against the former Deputy Chief Whip, Chris Pincher.
Yet by later in the day on Monday, the line from Downing Street had subtly changed again, now saying that the Prime Minister was not aware of allegations that were either resolved or did not progress to a formal complaint before Pincher became Deputy Chief Whip. But then today, there came this letter, tweeted first thing this morning by Simon MacDonald, the former head of the Foreign Office, blowing much of that apart. He said that Mr Johnson was briefed in person. There was a formal complaint. Allegations were resolved only in the sense the investigation was completed. Mr Pincher was not exonerated. And lo and behold, this afternoon, later, the Downing Street line changed again. The Prime Minister had been briefed after all. He just forgot.
Last week, when fresh allegations arose, the Prime Minister did not immediately recall the conversation in late 2019 about this incident. As soon as he was reminded, the Number 10 press office corrected their public lines. So the position is quite clear. Further inquiries will be made, but the position is that the Prime Minister acted with probity at all times.
The Prime Minister at 6 o'clock tonight then apologised, saying he wished he'd acted on the briefing his Downing Street had for days said he never received. Questions abound in every direction. Who was aware the Prime Minister was briefed? There would presumably have been minutes. Why weren't they checked before now if there were? Did no one come forward to say so? Why did it take a former Foreign Office official to make it clear? And is it really credible that the Prime Minister just forgot? And what does it say about how seriously he takes these matters that he did? And behind all of this, the Ministerial Code and the Civil Service Code each have embedded within them that the Prime Minister and his spokespeople have to tell the truth. Remember, all of this comes in the context of his press team already having to apologise for misleading journalists only weeks ago after Partygate, and where the Prime Minister has lost not just one, but two ethics advisers, hasn't found a third, and is under investigation for potentially misleading Parliament. Now, if the Pincher episode were the only story, we just wouldn't be here. The reason this could be lethal is that we've been here before. A pattern, a serious story fusing with questions about standards from the very top, about how the very top handles these stories and what they tell us. Wallpapergate, Owen Paterson, Partygate, now this. And the biggest question of all, behind them all, lurking behind all of these political problems, can you, the public, believe what Number 10 Downing Street and the Prime Minister are saying?
Thanks very much. Well, indeed, we've got text from the Alex Chalk letter, and he indeed goes through the litany of past problems. We'll come on to that in a moment, but now we can be joined by Lord Heseltine. In the absence of any defenders of the Prime Minister, let's hear from a long-time critic. Lord Heseltine, thank you so much for joining us tonight. You helped bring down Mrs Thatcher. Do you think ultimately Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak will bring down Boris Johnson or not?
I think that they are the Geoffrey Howe of the end of Mrs Thatcher. It was Geoffrey's resignation that precipitated the challenge, and it was the Cabinet that advised Mrs Thatcher that she couldn't win a second round. So I think we've got to that stage. I don't think there's any recovery for Boris Johnson. Your report is accurate. It is a matter of trust. Can you trust the British Prime Minister? And a very large number of people, not just in this country, not just in the Conservative Party, but across the world, have read the rooms. They know that he will say whatever suits him, regardless of whether it is true or not. And it started with the Brexit campaign, which was a pack of lies. It has gone through one example after another. This is simply, the Pincher case is just the last, if you like, the straw that broke the camel's back.
Now, when you challenged Mrs. Thatcher, it was of a quite different order. It wasn't about personal issues. It wasn't about the way she conducted herself. It was about policy. Do you see these two things as very different beasts?
I think totally different beasts. I mean, the issue with Margaret was about the poll tax and her anti-Europeanism. She'd just been there, frankly, too long. She'd done some very good things. I was very proud to have helped her in many important aspects of policy. But she had lost her judgment over the poll tax, which would the party. And the important thing about the Tory party is it has such an instinct for survival. It is the most successful political party in the history of democracy. It knows that in the end you have to listen to public opinion, you have to be trusted, you have to find a way of moulding your policies to that important centre ground of politics. And this government has failed to do that at a time, and this is important.
I think we're losing Lord Heseltine now. Just going to wait a second. Lord Heseltine,
run up to the next election.
But Lord Heseltine, Boris Johnson led the Conservatives to an extraordinary stonking majority. There may be a sense from MPs that if they can get him through this, if he can then be, as it were, corralled, that actually he might make it to the next election. Look, he's completely brought in three cabinet ministers and a new minister within a matter of hours. He has the ammunition there.
Yes, but you see, the reason he won such a substantial election is because he was going to get Brexit done. And Brexit being done, as we now have had years to find, has actually seen one of the worst economic circumstances this country faces, a lack of British prestige across the world, a devaluation of our currency, and 1 million people have left our country, leaving us short of people in the health service, in the parcels office, in the passport office, and the whole social services system is short of help. That's what Brexit has done. And people know they've been deceived. The public opinion polls reveal that totally clearly. There is now a significant majority against Brexit.
But if you look, and you're a keen, obviously, observer still of what's going on in Conservative politics, is there a leader, a potential leader around whom people can coalesce? Because at the moment there doesn't seem to be a particular movement around a particular figure, though of course you know what happened when you tried that.
Well, I think that is an important point, and it's widely made. Indeed, part of that is Boris's fault, because he has surrounded himself in the cabinet with people who may be nice and decent people, but they are not great leaders. And one thing they have in common is that they're great supporters of Boris Johnson. So there hasn't been the opportunity for the talent within the Conservative Party to be displayed widely. There hasn't been that coalition of all wings of the party in a way that most governments try to achieve. So. But I take a much more optimistic view. Cometh the moment, cometh the man or the woman, and events will unfold. I don't know how they will unfold, but the Conservative Party has that instinct to win, and to win you have to have people who can communicate and be trusted by the British people.
Lord Heseltine, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And just before we go to our next guest, we can read out that letter, that resignation letter from Alex Chalk, who resigned while we were on air. He writes, To be in government is to accept the duty to argue for difficult or even unpopular policy positions where that serves the broader national interest. But it cannot extend to defending the indefensible. He said that the time has come for fresh leadership, and the Prime Minister needs a Solicitor General who can defend the culture and course set on his watch. I regret that I no longer can. Pretty devastating words. We're joined now by the Conservative peer and Times columnist, Lord Finkelstein, Danny Finkelstein, the Spectator's deputy political editor, Katie Balls, and down the line by the former Cabinet Minister, Malcolm Rifkin. Thank you all very much for joining us. Danny Finkelstein, extraordinary resignations, another resignation tonight, and I'll ask you about that in a minute. But first of all, the two resignations that came within minutes of each other, those most senior figures in the Cabinet, bar the Home Secretary. What did you make of that?
Well, I think both of them had just felt they'd had enough. I think there'd been a long-standing dispute between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. So for him, it was a slightly different issue than the one for Sajid Javid. For Sajid Javid, it was primarily the lying. It was primarily repeating things on television that were not true. It is extraordinary, isn't it, that we're actually talking about Prime Minister, it was just the lying, isn't it? I've never used that phrase before, but it's impossible to react to, I forgot about Chris Pincher with any other response. Either he is completely incapable of holding ministerial office because he forgets that a senior colleague has been reprimanded through an official process for a pretty serious thing, which, in my view, means that he is incapable of holding office by itself, or he knew about it and didn't tell the truth about it. There's no other way around it, and I'm not keen to use that kind of phrase. I don't normally do so, but it's impossible to avoid, isn't it? And you know Alex Chalk, and we've just had that in the last few minutes. How important a resignation is that one? Well, he's obviously not like Rishi Sunak. No. But it's what it says about the party. Yes, lots of people in the party, I'm one of them, I heard Andrew Mitchell say the same thing, are very respectful of Alex Chalk. They think he's intelligent and principled. I've done lots of sort of events with him where he's found imaginative ways to express the view of the government while still remaining his own personality, saying his own things. The fact that he's come to this is pretty eloquent. Yes. But of course, Boris Johnson's moved fast to replace the Chancellor and the Health Secretary. He does. Yeah. Look, lots of ministers seem to think it's all right for them to stay. Right. Well, Katie Balls, tell me, how did this day move from that very quiet, angry letter and interview with Lord MacDonald to this farrago tonight?
I think since that interview, it's just descended as the day has gone on, and working from Parliament today, I think there's just been this big shift in mood. And of course, Tory MPs have been unhappy with Boris Johnson for some time, I think for really all of this year so far. I think the ministers have been growing increasingly frustrated. But I think actually the intervention and the sense that it wasn't a new thing to believe that Downing Street is not being completely straight with the truth, but I think it made some confront it in a way they weren't necessarily doing before, or they were hoping the number 10 operation would change in a way which would mean these problems don't happen. And the fact there's still self-forced errors, I think has made ministers and MPs conclude that actually it's not so much about changing the team around Boris Johnson, it's about changing the leader. But if you look at the language and the tone, for example, when Chris Mason asked if Boris Johnson used the words pincher by name, pincher by nature, he tried to bat it off the first time. The second time he couldn't bat it off. It was obviously, he couldn't deny it. He didn't deny it. And I wonder now if that, that kind of loose talk is just completely unacceptable now among someone that actually occupies the office in Downing Street. Well, I think the interview was uncomfortable, and lots of people watching it would have noted the fact that he didn't deny it. Yeah. However, I also think just the fact that the interview happened, was aired at 6 p.m, the interview didn't even stop on the televisions before the news broke that Sajid Javid had resigned. I think it was too little too late. Even if you bought the idea that the Prime Minister was sincere in his apology, I think the apology came too late in the day. Malcolm Rifkin, when do you think, can you pinpoint a time when you think that Boris Johnson first became vulnerable? I think he first became vulnerable the day he became Prime Minister. It was a terrible decision that was taken. He was a superb campaigner at an election, but he was totally unfit to be Prime Minister, and a lot of people knew that right from the very beginning. So it was an enormous gamble and one that shouldn't have been taken. But he was a man that delivered a majority of 80. Precisely, he was a great campaigner. But the whole point of an election is to produce a government, not just to win, but to produce a government that will govern in the national interest. And there he has been, I'm afraid, a very severe disappointment.
We've talked a little bit about Alex Chalk, particularly because, of course, Danny Finkelstein knows him. But just let me take you back to Rishi Sunak and also to Sajid Javid. Tell me about the calibre of those people and the impact of their resignation.
Well, I think it's hugely important. Remember, when we had the vote of confidence in the Prime Minister a few weeks ago, just under 150 Conservative MPs voted against him. That did not include any members of the government or of what is called the payroll. Now, all they need is a further 30 MPs to join that 150, and Johnson is automatically out. Today, we've had 10 of that 30, led by the Sunak and Javid, but also 8 or 9, now Alex Chalk, about 10 altogether, some rather junior members of the government, but all of whom have been supporters. There must be already at least another 20 Tory MPs who voted for Johnson a few weeks ago, but cannot stomach it any longer. So he's out. It's only a question is whether it'll take hours, days, or a week or so.
Do you think he's out, Danny Finkelstein?
I think he will go, yes. But he won't go necessarily immediately. The fact is the vote of no confidence strengthened him because it means that they've got to get through the barrier of the rules. There are quite a lot of Tory MPs who think that changing rules is a bad idea. Nevertheless, I think that the mood is now turned against him. These resignations are a symbol of that, and I think he will.
And just to reiterate the rules, the committee of the 22 can change the time span before a second vote of confidence from a year to 6 months. They could do it for 6 weeks, couldn't they? Or is it just 6 months? They could change it to any.
I mean, they could change the rules however they want to do, and ultimately a new committee will be decided before the summer recess. And if the majority of the new executive on this committee decide to change the rules, they can change the rules. I think in politics, effectively, although Boris Johnson was technically safe after that vote, if the political will or majority in the party is against you, I think MPs will find a way. I think that it's really hard right now to find many MPs who believe Boris Johnson will lead them into the next election. But in terms of exact timings, I think there is a mix of opinion as to whether this is days, weeks, months, maybe even next year.
And Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid and Oliver Dowden have shown some gumption.
Of course, Oliver Dowden too.
And that provides a sense that there's an alternative leadership to Boris Johnson in the party. There's an alternative direction. There's some sense that something else can be done. And that's very important to this as well.
But by the very nature of what we said earlier was that those two resignation letters were not coordinated. There doesn't appear to be a grand movement, a momentum from one particular area.
Kirsty, if I may.
I'll bring Lord Rifkin in on that, yes.
Yeah, if I could just comment on that particular point. Margaret Thatcher's departure as Prime Minister began not because of the MPs by themselves. It was when her support within the cabinet and within the government began to dissolve. Now, that process began this morning, and it began with, obviously, the Chancellor and Sajid Javid. We're now up to 10 members of the administration have already gone. There must be, it's bound to be the case, that others are contemplating, do they wish to remain in this sinking ship? And that is when a government eventually disposes of a Prime Minister that has become a total liability instead of an asset. We're now at that stage.
But are we talking about change of direction for the party as well as a change of leadership, Katie Bowles?
Well, I'm sorry.
I think that's an interesting thing. If we do end up in a leadership contest in the future, here I think what the majority of MPs who want Boris Johnson to go have decided on is that Boris Johnson is the problem. I think if you actually drill them down on what they think the solution is, they go in various different ways. They have different views.
Which is problematic, of course.
And you have One Nation Tories who want Boris Johnson to go, who have views
of which Alex Chalk was one.
Yeah, exactly. Andrew Mitchell all have views on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which are very different to ERG members like Steve Baker, who also want Boris Johnson to go. So if we do get a leadership contest, it's going to be incredibly messy.
Well, it's interesting because
a new direction, which is trying to tell the truth, trying not to break the law, trying to have some sort of coherence between number 10 and number 11 Downing Street. Those are new directions in themselves.
But you could end up in a situation where you kind of self-implode, because then you look back on Boris Johnson and say, goodness knows, we sort of knew what he was about, but now we don't know the direction.
I think all MPs...
We actually don't know what Boris Johnson is about, forgive me.
You've got to try and think what the right thing is.
I'll come to you in a minute, Lord Rifkin. Yeah, Lord Rifkin, can I just turn for a moment?
I'm not Lord Rifkin.
Sorry, no, I'm terribly sorry. I'm ennobling you. I'm very sorry, terribly sorry. Can I just talk about Scotland for a second? Because the antipathy to Boris Johnson in Scotland is said to be pretty widespread. You know, we know that Ruth Davidson didn't really want him there at the last Scottish elections. Tell me, would it make a difference, do you think, to the fight to save the union among Conservatives and others if Boris Johnson was no longer Prime Minister?
Well, it certainly wouldn't do any harm, because the antipathy to Boris Johnson in Scotland is now matched by an equal antipathy to Boris Johnson in England and Wales as well. So it's no longer a north-south divide or a Scotland-England divide. Pretty well the whole country thinks he is a loser, should not be Prime Minister, does not have the integrity or the honesty to command this position. And, you know, at the end of the day, a real Prime Minister with any proper principles doesn't just consider their own skin. He should be asking himself, what is in the national interest at the moment? And he knows perfectly well the country wants him to go, and the quicker he goes, the better.
Well, of course, it's a crystal ball question, but when it comes to a leadership election, who do you think would be going for who would be going for leader?
Oh, well, I think both the people who've resigned today, Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak, will consider themselves rightly to be candidates. I think Nadhim Zahawi will. I suspect Penny Mordaunt will. I suspect Liz Truss will. But I think those people who didn't resign will pay a price for not doing that.
Tell me, Katie.
Yeah, I think that's true, though at the same time I think something that Rishi Sunak will also face now a block from some of the more loyalist MPs to Boris Johnson, of which you would imagine there are at least around 100. So we'll see how that all plays out. So I think there will be disadvantage on either side where you are when it comes to this leadership contest. But also, what we do know is Boris Johnson is not about to resign. No. So this is going to, I think, become more painful in terms of if he goes, when he goes. And actually, in any other situation, I think we'd be talking about discussions in Downing Street as to whether he might choose to go, what he could say, a graceful exit. That's not the territory we're in. And I think it does make the next few weeks and months unpredictable.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. Time now to just quickly look at the front pages. And The Sun, the last chance saloon, Boris knifed on day from hell is The Sun. The Times, Johnson on the brink. The Prime Minister rocked as Chancellor and Health Secretary quit. Sunak, I've been loyal, but we cannot continue like this. Moving on to the Metro, going, gone, but the PM is still clinging on to power. Ministers in a pincher movement. And the Daily Mail, can even Boris, the greased piglet, wriggle out of this? Battling for survival. PM in crisis after both Sunak and Javid sensationally resigned, but he fights back, making Zahawi his bold Chancellor. Well, we'll be back with more on this and much more on other things as well tomorrow night. From all of us here, a very good night. Goodbye. Thank you so much. That just...